The first Sherman died before its crew understood the ridge had teeth. Erhard Kessler settled the burning shape into his gun sight, held the turret steady against the slope, and drove a single 88mm round through the frontal plate at a range of 800 meters. And the machine came apart from the inside as its own stowed rounds caught and turned the fighting compartment into a sealed furnace. Smoke stood over the wheat like a raised flag. Kessler was already traversing toward the next target before the flame reached its full height. He commanded the Tiger tank marked with the turret number 212, and by that afternoon in the first week of August of 1944, the men working the field south of Caen had learned to read that number the way a sailor reads a fin cutting the surface. His gun had opened the engagement, and his gun set the tempo now. He did not rush. He let each target roll forward another few meters until the angle was perfect. Then he fired once, and once was enough. A second Sherman brewed up near a shattered farm wall. A third tried to reverse into the smoke of the first two, exposed its thinner side armor in the turn, and took a round through the running gear that stopped it dead, and left the crew clawing at the hatches, while the tank began to burn beneath them. Kessler was not alone on that ground. 4 more Tigers moved with him in a loose wedge across the high fields, 60 tons of steel each, their frontal armor better than 100mm thick, their long guns capable of killing anything the Allied armies could put in front of them from beyond the range at which those Allied tanks could answer. Together, the 5 machines had turned a single wheat-covered ridge into a killing ground in under 4 minutes. The British squadron that had crested that ridge at speed, confident, running hard for a crossroads 2 kilometers on, now sat scattered and burning across 300 meters of open slope. And the survivors had gone silent on the radio net, because there was nothing useful left to say. Into that silence rolled the one machine on the field that could hurt him, and almost no one watching believed it could. It was a Sherman, or it looked like one, low and ordinary in the smoke, the same welded hull the Germans had killed a dozen times that day already. But its gun was wrong. Where the standard Sherman carried a stubby 75mm piece that could not scratch a Tiger's face at any honest distance, this one carried a 17-pounder, a long British anti-tank gun grafted into the turret through months of desperate improvisation, a weapon that fired a discarding sabot round fast enough and hard enough to punch clean through the front of a Tiger, where every other Allied gun simply bounced. The soldiers called the variant a Firefly. There was one of them for every 3 normal tanks in a troop, sometimes fewer, and the enemy had learned to hunt that long barrel first, because the long barrel was the only thing on the entire ridge that could turn a Tiger into scrap. The gunner riding behind that 17-pounder was 19 years old, and his name was Nathan Poole. He had been in France for 6 weeks. He had never yet fired his gun at a Tiger, only at half-tracks and at a distant gun position, and once at a haystack that turned out to be empty. His hands were steady, which surprised him, but everything he had been trained to do assumed a fair fight or something close to it, and there was nothing fair about the slope in front of him. His troop had gone up that ridge as 4 tanks. It was now 1. The commander riding above him in the open hatch was a corporal who had inherited the job an hour earlier when the sergeant's tank was among the first to burn, and the corporal was reading a battlefield that offered no good choices, only a scale of how quickly a man might die. The Firefly had one advantage, and it was thin. The enemy did not yet know exactly where it was. Poole's crew had done what every Firefly crew learned to do if they wanted to live past their first serious action. They had painted the long barrel of the 17-pounder in 2 tones, dark at the base and pale toward the muzzle, a crude trick that broke up the outline and made the gun read from a distance as the short, harmless stub of an ordinary Sherman. They had crept the tank into the lee of a low stone bank at the field's edge, hull down, only the turret and that disguised gun showing above the stone, engine idling, the whole machine trying to be a shadow among the wrecks. For the moment it worked. Kessler's attention was 200 meters to the left, finishing the 3rd troop, and the 4 other Tigers were pushing forward in their wedge with the confidence of men who had already won, and simply had not finished collecting. That was the trap Poole's tank was built for, and it was also the trap most likely to get every man inside it killed. The 17-pounder was a magnificent gun and a cruel one to serve. It was long, which meant it reached, but the length made the turret nose-heavy and slow to swing. It kicked with a violence the standard Sherman never knew, a blast so fierce that it threw up a boiling cloud of dust and smoke from the ground in front of the muzzle every time it fired, a cloud that hung in the still August air and pointed straight back at the tank that had made it. And the rounds were enormous, brass cases as long as a man's arm, so that the loader, sweating in the cramped left side of the turret, needed a long 2 or 3 seconds to wrestle the next shell home and slam the breech. In that gap the Firefly could not fire again. In that gap, if the enemy had seen the dust, the enemy could. Poole understood all of this the way a diver understands the depth of the water above him. One shot would announce him. One shot would tell 5 Tiger commanders exactly which shadow at the field's edge was the only real threat on the ridge, and the dust from his own muzzle would hold the answer in the air for anyone who cared to look. After that first shot, he would have to kill, and keep killing, faster than they could turn their heavy, slow turrets to find him. And he would have to do it with a gun that needed 3 seconds to reload, and a machine that needed most of a minute to reposition, against armor that his one gun could defeat only if he struck it in exactly the right place. The corporal in the hatch made the decision because someone had to. He put his eyes on the nearest Tiger, the one leading the wedge, the one drifting slowly across their front at a range Poole could just about trust, showing the flat of its side as it turned to press toward the burning Shermans. Side armor, 80 millimeters, less than half the thickness of the front and square to Poole's gun. It was the shot. It was, quite possibly, the only clean killing shot the Firefly would be given all afternoon, and it would have to be perfect, because a hit that failed to punch through would do nothing except paint a target on the stone bank and invite the entire wedge to answer. Poole laid the sight on the Tiger's flank, just below the turret ring, where the fighting compartment sat and the ammunition was stowed. He breathed out. He waited for the machine to settle its weight into the low ground and give him a still target for 1 full second. Then he fired, and the world came apart in noise and dust, and the 17-pounder did what it had been built and smuggled and painted and hidden to do. The sabot round crossed the field faster than sound, struck the Tiger below the turret ring at a shallow downward angle, and drove through 80 millimeters of side plate as if the plate were an afterthought. Inside the German tank, the shot did not so much explode as detonate everything it touched. The stowed rounds went in a single instant. The turret, weighing more than a small truck, lifted off its ring on a column of white fire and came down twisted in the wheat 10 meters from the hull. And the hull itself sat back on its tracks and burned with a heat that pushed the surrounding grass flat. 1 Tiger gone, 4 remained. And the dust from Poole's own gun rose off the field in a tall pale plume and hung in the windless air, pointing back at the stone bank like an accusing finger. And Erhard Kessler, 200 meters away, turned his head toward it. Kessler had heard the difference. The crack of a 17-pounder did not sound like a 75, and a man who had survived this long in a Tiger survived by knowing exactly what had just tried to kill his platoon. He did not panic. Panic was for the men in the burning Shermans. He simply began, with terrible unhurried competence, to bring the long gun of 212 around toward the field's edge, toward the dust, toward the one shadow among the wrecks that had proven it could reach him. And the 3 other Tigers of the wedge started their own slow turrets grinding in the same direction. 5,500 kilograms of armored turret each, swinging toward a 19-year-old, and a gun that needed 3 more seconds to reload. Inside the Firefly, the loader was already fighting the next shell home, arms burning, the spent case clanging hot against the floor. Poole had his sight full of the second Tiger now, but the second Tiger's front was toward him, that impossible glacis plate that his round might not beat. And the corporal in the hatch had just seen Kessler's barrel come level with the bank, and there was no longer any question of choosing a good shot. There was only the reload, and the 3 seconds, and the 88mm gun that would not need 3 seconds at all. The 3 seconds did not belong to Poole. They belonged to the loader, a broad-shouldered private named Alcott, who had wrestled these long shells into this breach across France and Belgium, and who now, with Kessler's barrel dropping level with the stone bank, did the fastest work of his life in a space too small to stand in. He caught the next round from the ready rack, swung it toward the open breech with his hip taking the weight, and drove it home with the heel of his hand, in a single motion that split the skin across 2 knuckles and did not slow him at all. The breech block slammed, the gun was live again, and in the same instant the corporal above him understood that firing a second time from the same spot would simply confirm the enemy's math, that the dust already hanging over the bank had drawn every heavy gun on the ridge toward this one patch of stone, and that the only crew still alive at the field's edge in 1 minute would be the crew that was no longer where the smoke said it should be. So Poole did not take the shot the gun was begging him to take. The tank moved instead. The driver, working blind on the corporal's read of the ground, threw the Sherman into reverse and dragged it backward along the lee of the stone bank, keeping the low wall between the hull and the German guns, sacrificing the perfect hull-down firing position for 2 things that mattered more in that moment than any single shot: distance and a new angle the enemy had not yet plotted. The engine screamed. The tracks tore the field. And Kessler's first answering round, the 88 fired at the place the dust had marked, cracked through the air where the Firefly's turret had sat 1 full second earlier, and blew a truck-sized bite out of the stone bank, throwing a curtain of pulverized rock across the field that did, for a few precious seconds, exactly what the enemy's dust had done to Poole. It hid everything. That was the shape of the fight now, and Poole understood it with a clarity that had nothing to do with courage and everything to do with arithmetic. He could not win a duel of speed. 5 heavy guns against his one meant that any exchange fought in the open, gun for gun, ended with the Firefly burning. He could win only by refusing to be where they aimed, by making every shot from a different piece of cover, by trading the killing power of his 17-pounder for the one currency the Tigers could not easily buy back: surprise, spent one round at a time and immediately abandoned. It was a way of fighting that asked a 19-year-old to accept that he would be hunted continuously by men who were better than him, in machines heavier than his, and to keep shooting anyway. He kept shooting. The Sherman burst out of the rock dust at the far end of the bank, 20 meters from where it had killed the first Tiger, and now the geometry had shifted in a way Kessler had not yet corrected for. The German wedge had turned to face the old firing position. In turning, the second Tiger had once again given up the flat of its flank, presenting to Poole's new angle the same 80mm side plate that his round could beat. And Poole did not hesitate the way he had hesitated the first time, did not wait for the perfect still second, because there were no perfect seconds left anywhere on that ridge. He laid the sight, corrected once for the range, and fired into the moving flank, and the 17-pounder threw its cloud and its violence, and drove a second sabot round through a second Tiger below the turret ring. The machine shuddered, stopped, and began to pour black smoke from every seam. Before the flame found the fuel and finished it, 2 Tigers gone, 3 remained. And the dust rose again, and again it pointed, and again Poole was already moving before it reached its full height. Kessler adjusted. That was the thing about the man in 212 that made him so much more dangerous than the burning wrecks behind him suggested. He was not fighting the last shot, he was fighting the next one. He had watched the Firefly reappear 20 meters from where it died, and he understood the pattern now, understood that this crew fired and ran, and that the way to kill a thing that fired and ran was not to chase the smoke but to guess the ground. He stopped traversing toward the dust. He began instead to read the field's edge the way Poole read the field's center, looking for the next low place, the next wall, the next fold of earth. A fleeing Sherman would naturally choose, and he brought his long gun to bear not on where the Firefly had been, but on where a frightened, clever crew would go next. And he was, very nearly, right. He put his round into the gap between 2 hedgerow stumps that offered the only clean firing lane along that stretch of the bank, the exact gap the corporal had been steering toward, and the 88mm shell struck the earth bank a meter to the left of the Sherman's nose as the tank came into the lane, close enough that the impact rang the hull like a struck bell, and threw the whole crew against their harnesses, and filled the fighting compartment with a shock that Poole felt in his teeth and his spine and the roots of his hands. The tank did not die. The round had struck earth, not steel, but it had come so close that every man inside understood the margin had just narrowed to nothing, that Kessler was no longer shooting at smoke, but at prediction, and that the game of appearing and vanishing had perhaps 3 more rounds left in it before the Germans' arithmetic caught up with Poole's luck. The corporal changed the rules again, because the old rules were about to get them killed. Instead of running the length of the bank to the next obvious firing position, the position Kessler was surely already ranging, he ordered the driver to do the one thing a hunted tank was not supposed to do: to turn away from the enemy entirely, to drop off the reverse slope of the ridge into the dead ground the Germans could not see into, and to run flat out along the hidden side of the high field toward its far corner. For 20 seconds the Firefly showed the enemy nothing but the crest of the ridge and its own churned dust. It was blind to them, and they were blind to it. And in that blindness the corporal was spending the last thing he had, gambling that he could cover 300 meters of dead ground faster than 3 Tiger commanders could reason out where he had gone, and reorient a wedge of 60-ton machines to meet him at the far corner. It was a race run entirely on the inside of the hill, unseen, decided by nothing but engine and nerve. And while it ran, Alcott loaded the next round in the dark and the swaying and the diesel stink, and got the breech shut and got his bleeding hand clear of it ready for whatever waited when the tank came back over the crest. What waited was the flank of the entire German position. The corporal had guessed the ground correctly, more correctly than he had any right to, and when the Firefly climbed back into the sunlight at the far corner of the field, it did so behind and to the side of the 3 surviving Tigers, looking now not at their thick invulnerable fronts, but at the sloped rear decks, and the vulnerable flanks of machines still pointed the wrong way, still hunting the ghost they expected to find back at the stone bank. For one heartbeat Poole had the finest firing solution any Firefly gunner was ever given. 3 Tigers strung out across his front with their backs half toward him, and the only question was which to kill first, and Poole answered it the way the enemy had taught him to answer it all afternoon. He killed the leader. He put the sabot round into the third tiger's flank at a range so close he could not miss, and an angle so square the armor had no chance to turn it. And the shot went through the side, and into the fuel, and the third tiger simply came apart, its rear deck blowing upward in a sheet of burning diesel that rolled across the wheat and set the field itself alight. 3 tigers gone, 2 remained. And now, at last, the 2 that remained knew exactly where he was, because there was no more hiding at a range of 150 meters, with the wheat burning between them, and the fight stopped being a hunt and became, in its final phase precisely, the open gun-for-gun duel. Poole had spent the entire afternoon refusing to fight. The 4th tiger died in the turn. Its commander, quicker than his crew, threw his turret around toward the Firefly at a speed those heavy machines could barely manage. And for a moment, the long 88 came swinging toward Poole with murder in it. But the turn that brought the gun to bear also held the tank's flank toward him for the length of the traverse. And Alcott had the gun loaded, and the corporal had already called the target, and Poole fired into the flank before the German gun had finished its swing. The 4th tiger's turret jammed half-traversed, smoke pouring from the ring, the crew bailing out into a field that was itself now on fire. 4 tigers gone, 1 remained, and the one that remained was 212, and Erhard Kessler did not turn his flank to anyone. Kessler had watched 4 machines burn in an afternoon, and he had learned from each of them. And he did the one thing none of the others had done. He drove straight at the Firefly, nose on, presenting Poole with nothing but the thick-sloped glacis that the 17-pounder could not reliably beat, closing the range with the cold logic of a man who understood that his frontal armor was a wall the boy's gun could not climb, and that all he had to do was keep that wall between them and put 188 round into the lightly armored Sherman to end the entire day. He came on fast across the burning wheat, gun leveled, and Poole's first round in the final duel struck that sloped front plate square and true, and skipped off it in a spray of white sparks and did not penetrate, exactly as Kessler had wagered it would not, and the German gun answered. The 88 round struck the Firefly's hull front and did not fully penetrate either, stopped by the angle and by a handspan of luck, but the impact tore the front hull machine gun from its mount and filled the driver's compartment with spall and smoke and knocked the entire crew half senseless. And now the Firefly sat wounded and half-blind in the open at a range, closing toward 100 meters against the one enemy on the ridge who could not be beaten from the front. Alcott, deafened, bleeding from both ears now, found the next round by feel and loaded it. Poole, with blood running into one eye from where his head had struck the sight, understood that he had perhaps one more shot before Kessler's next round found the killing angle, and that a frontal shot would skip away exactly as the last one had, and that he was out of dead ground and out of cover and nearly out of time. So he did the last thing left to do, the thing the whole afternoon had been teaching him. He stopped shooting at the armor and started shooting at the machine. As Kessler's Tiger crested a low swell in the burning field, its nose lifting for a fraction of a second the way any tank's nose lifts when it climbs, the movement exposed for that one instant the thinner belly plate beneath the glacis, and above it, the join where the driver's visor met the hull. Poole did not aim for the front. He aimed for the seam. He fired into the base of the glacis at the exact moment the climbing hull unmasked it, and the 17-pounder's sabot round struck the lower plate where it was thin, and where the angle for once worked against the German and not the boy, and it went in. The round entered the driver's compartment and did not stop. It crossed the fighting compartment of 212 and found the forward ammunition stowage, and Erhard Kessler's Tiger, the machine that had opened the battle and killed the first Sherman, and set the tempo for an entire afternoon of slaughter, died the way it had made so many others die, from the inside in a single white instant, its turret rising off its ring on a pillar of its own detonating rounds, and crashing down inverted in the burning wheat. 5 tigers gone, none remained. And the field's edge, where a 19-year-old in a disguised gun had hidden in a shadow 4 minutes and a lifetime earlier, went quiet, except for the sound of 5 separate fires, consuming the finest tanks the German army could field. Nathan Poole did not climb out to look at what he had done, not for a long time. The crew sat inside their wounded, smoking Firefly, in the middle of a burning field, ears ringing, hands shaking now that there was nothing left to hold them steady, and they listened to the ammunition still cooking off inside the 5 wrecks around them, and did not speak, because there was nothing to say, and because none of them, if they had spoken, would have trusted their own voices. The corporal in the hatch, who had inherited his command 1 hour and 5 destroyed tigers ago, kept his eyes on the ridge line out of pure habit, watching for a sixth machine that never came. Somewhere below the reverse slope, British infantry who had gone to ground when the first troop burned began, cautiously, to lift their heads. What they found when they finally came up onto the high field was a thing that did not fit the war as they understood it. 5 Tigers, the machines that had taught 2 Allied armies to fear open ground, sat destroyed across 300 meters of scorched wheat, and there was no squadron of Sherman strewn victorious among them, no artillery scars, no sign of the overwhelming force it should have taken to do such a thing. There was one Sherman, hull-scarred, its front machine gun torn away, its long gun still faintly smoking, sitting alone at the center of the killing ground it had made. The infantry counted the wrecks twice, because the first count seemed impossible, and then they looked at the single tank in the middle of them and understood, slowly, that the count was not impossible at all, that it had simply been done by one gun and one crew, and one boy who had refused, round by round and shadow by shadow, to fight the battle the enemy wanted him to fight. The 17-pounder had been smuggled into that turret through months of argument and improvisation, precisely so that somewhere, someday, a single Sherman might stand against the Tigers on something like even terms. And for one afternoon south of Caen, it had done more than that. The men who painted its barrel in 2 tones and hid its shape, and taught its crews to fire and vanish had believed, at best, in survival, in a fair chance where before there had been none. They had not dared to imagine a 19-year-old turning that thin fair chance into the wholesale destruction of an entire Tiger platoon in under 5 minutes. But belief and imagination had nothing to do with what happened on that ridge. Arithmetic did. Nerve did. The willingness to give up the perfect shot for the next living second did, over and over, until the arithmetic that had begun the day so heavily in Erhard Kessler's favor had been reversed entirely and turned back upon him. They had asked in the way soldiers always ask, who had done it, expecting a name they would forget by nightfall. What they got instead was the single scarred Sherman and its silent crew and the 5 burning shapes. And in the days that followed, as the story moved down the line the way such stories move, the tank with the long disguised gun and the boy behind it stopped being an ordinary Firefly and became something the men repeated to one another in the dark before their own bad mornings. The Tigers had been the terror of that ground. For one afternoon, a single hidden gun had been the terror of the Tigers. And the field south of Caen, where 5 of the finest tanks in the world had come to collect an easy victory, and had instead been dismantled one flank at a time by an underdog they never managed to properly see, held its 5 fires long into the evening, until there was nothing left in any of them to burn.